Welcome to the day 3 of the June 2023 convening. My task is to introduce Professor Lumumba and moderate the Q&A when time allows for that. Professor Lumumba, as a true, ardent, erudite, and dynamic Pan-Africanist or Pan-Africanism ideologue, doesn't really require much introduction. But the essential thing is that this plenary session is under the title, Exploring the Significance of Pan-Africanism in Cultivating Leadership within African Higher Education Institutions. So given that it doesn't require much introduction, I will greatly welcome him to deliver the keynote.
Thank you very much for that very brief and apt introduction. I'm an opponent of long introductions because nobody actually remembers what is read. But let me say first how glad I am to have been invited to be present in this august assembly. It is not lost on me that you have senior academics drawn from different institutions across the continent of Africa, quite a number of whom are known to me, who are running institutions at the highest level and are senior academics. I'm also aware that there are junior academics who are rising through the ranks. And I'm humbled to be invited to share my thoughts with you on what I consider to be very significant, particularly at this stage in the history of Africa. And in order to contextualize my conversation, I will deliver no lecture, because I believe that conversations are a lot more enriching, a lot more realistic, because some of the things I'll be speaking about and speaking to are things that are known to you. And what I'll be doing is possibly to speak about them from a different perspective. When one talks about Pan-Africanism, particularly today, there is the tendency from the one side to romanticize Pan-Africanism, to articulate Pan-Africanism as if it were a magic wand, which, when waved, will solve all African problems, whether they are technological, commercial, political, or otherwise. Then, from another perspective, that there are those who think that Pan-Africanism is merely a curiosity, one that we take refuge in order to massage our egos without more. But Pan-Africanism is serious business. It is serious business because it helps to give us a worldview of what we can do in order to give Africa and Africans a sense of direction and a sense of esteem. And Pan-Africanism must be traced to its origins. And of course, one will not go to the period prior to the interaction between Africa and other civilizations. But there was some element of Pan-Africanism. And those of you who are familiar with the works of Cheikh Anta Diop will be familiar with his very able articulation of the state of Africa before the advent of the colonizers, before the advent of slavery, classical slavery as we know it. But we must, in the nature of things, have what I call a historical cut-off point, particularly when we want to contextualize our discourse in the arena of education generally and higher education specifically. You will be familiar with the very early ideas of the great Sylvester Williams of Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean, when the whole idea of Pan-Africanism was gaining traction in the middle part of the 19th century. Fundamentally, as a reaction to the manner in which the African had been treated during slavery and the manner in which the African was being treated during colonization. And in its very embryonic stages, one begins to hear Africans talking about education as they understood it then, as one of the key avenues via which liberation understood broadly could be achieved. That ignorance was not bliss. You wanted to create an army of young men and women whose worldview was informed in a particular direction, the direction of liberating Africans, whether they were in the mother continent, in the continent of Africa, or they were in the diaspora in the Caribbean, or in Latin America, or Europe, or Australia. And you will see the series of meetings that are then held during that period. And specifically, they are iconic interactions, because when the colonizer came into the continent of Africa, education was informed by the colonizer. So that if you went to the former Portuguese colonies, there was a very deliberate effort on the part of the Portuguese to recruit a cadre of individuals who would then be taken to Lisbon to be trained and to go back, whether it was Guinea-Bissau or to Angola or Cabo Verde or to Mozambique or to Brazil, in order to serve the colonial infrastructure. And there were very few recruited in that regard. And when one is talking about education in many countries, one can actually identify them, because they then became political leaders in their various countries and were involved in establishing educational institutions. You can talk about Agostinho Neto in Angola, and you will read his poems to understand how great a mind he was. You will talk about Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde. You'll talk about Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique. And you come to the former French colonies, the same. And there are people from La Côte d'Ivoire here. You'll know that institutions such as the Sorbonne had specific faculties that were created for the purpose of recruiting young Africans, people like Leopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal, Félix Houphouët-Boigny. And these were individuals who were specifically identified and picked to go for what was fundamentally indoctrination. And of course, the British also did the same thing. And that is how you then understand how they were picked, whether you are talking about in countries such as Zambia, they would pick people like Kenneth David Kaunda. In Malawi, Kamuzu Hastings Banda. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. In Tanzania, Julius Kambarage Nyerere, and one would go on and on. And even if you went to the apartheid regimes in South Africa, you'll find that individuals such as Nelson Mandela were directed towards Fort Hare. And Fort Hare was deliberately designed to train young people in order to support what was fundamentally a legal regime and a political regime that was meant to perpetuate itself. If you go to Namibia, and I'm mentioning these individuals because later they become the leaders who are involved in dealing with education in Africa. You go to Namibia, Sam Nujoma did not go to school very much, but he had his stint, and Ndimba Toivo, and one can count all of them. So that the Africa that you are talking about and the education that you are talking about is an education system that was designed to undergird the colonial system. Recently, I went to Zanzibar, and a young man was taking me through the stone town of Zanzibar, and he had the most amazing interpretation. He told me, this is one of the schools that they built in order to teach Africans to think like them. Then this is one of the churches that they created so that they could teach the Africans to worship like them and to paralyze their spirituality. And this is one of the hospitals where they treated them when they were sick so that they could serve them. I thought that was ingenious. It was a correct interpretation, so that whenever the African was educated, it was not by design that you should help your fellow Africans. That was coincidental. You are simply an agent and a vessel for purposes of ensuring that you serve the colonial masters. The French and the Portuguese were more blatant. And the good professor from La Côte d'Ivoire will tell you that when they took people to the parades, one of the things they would do for the Africans to say, our ancestors, the Gauls. An African saying that their ancestors were the Gauls. And it is in that context that therefore you must understand when we are talking about the establishment of education facilities across the continent of Africa, universities were informed by that. Whether it was the University of East Africa with campuses in Kampala, Makerere for medicine, the Royal Technical College in Nairobi for engineering, the University of Dar es Salaam for law, and if you came here in Ghana when they established the Achimota College, and I want you to look at the founding instruments of Achimota and why they established Achimota, and they were doing that in King's College Budo in Uganda and later in Kisubi. The whole idea was to create an African man and woman who was fundamentally an automaton, designed to serve the master, designed to serve the puppeteer. He or she was meant to be a puppet. You know, this debate begins to crystallize a lot more visibly in the United States when you are talking about Pan-Africanism. Because the United States is grappling the black man has been released from slavery. They have been told that they would get 40 acres and 1 mule, which they never receive. They have recruited the Uncle Toms, and they are persuading the black people at that time that what you need are a set of skills. Be a good plumber. Be a good electrician. And in the United States, you begin to see a battle and two streams. Booker Taliaferro Washington, whom you will remember, and his college in Tuskegee in Alabama, who says the Negro must go to this education institution in order to be trained to have a set of skills, to conform. But there is another stream of W.E.B. Du Bois, who says education must be revolutionary. It must change your mind. It must change your thinking. We must think differently. If they have Harvard, we must have Howard. We must think differently. And at that time, a young South African is also visiting and learning in the United States of America. People never talk about him as much as they should. Pixley Kaisaka Seme. Many people don't know, but there is a book written about him as the founder of the African National Congress. Pixley Kaisaka Seme is then a student at the University of Columbia, and he delivers one of the most iconic speeches ever delivered by an African in the month of April 1906, the regeneration of Africa. And I commend it to you. He says at that time, and I paraphrase rather than quote Pixley Kaisa Kasem, that Africa must rise again. It must rise from the morass of confusion in which she finds herself. And it is not lost on me that Pixley delivers that lecture in the year 1906. And in 1912, the African National Congress is then founded in South Africa, with Pixley Kaisa Kaseme and Sir Albert Luthuli as some of the leading lights, and of course, Governor Mbeki and others. They are beginning to recognize that education is important. At that time, you also see other Africans going to the United States. Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, Zik of Africa, to Lincoln College in the United States of America. Kwame Nkrumah is also going to school at that time. Mwalimu Nyerere is in Edinburgh. Kamuzu Banda is also in Edinburgh. People are going. Africa is beginning to see education as something that is important. James Kwejir Agri of Africa, who later became the first black deputy principal of Achimota College and a teacher of the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah. They are taking all these individuals to Europe and America in the belief that these individuals will do their bidding. But they do not know that they are planting a seed which is going to germinate in a totally different way, and to give birth to an educational system which is going to revolutionize the continent of Africa. And you can see quite a number of Africans, even when you go to the former French colonies, you see that wave of Leopold Senghor, as I talked about, Felix Houphouët-Boigny, you see Ahmed Ben Bella, Bibo Giba. All these are individuals, Cheikh Anta Diop. All these individuals are going to that part of the world, but the colonizers do not for one moment believe that they are going to come back and be the agents of change and be the agents of revolution of education in the continent of Africa. And this is important because the spirit of Pan-Africanism is then being planted at that time. A series of meetings, as I've already indicated, are held in the Caribbean and ultimately culminating in the much more famous meeting in 1945 in Manchester in the United Kingdom, where some of the names that you can recognize are present in Manchester, where the spirit of Pan-Africanism, which is revivalism of individuals who did not go to school, I want us to see education from a totally different perspective. You can see a little later people like Marcus Garvey. No formal education, but they are influenced by this spirit of Pan-Africanism when he sings, Garvey was a buffalo soldier in the heart of America. When you hear people like Fela Anikulapo Kuti, much later in Nigeria, Miriam Makeba, from Southern Africa, you can see the arts are being influenced by these. And ultimately, when we talk about Pan-Africanism 1945, you begin to see a people who know that in order for Africa to realize her potential, her people must begin to work together. And it's instructive. You see people like Walter Rodney from Guyana. These are academics. Ame Sessoa from Martinique. And you can see the writing at that time. After 1945, we then begin to see the agitation, both from the political front and across the continent. Kwame Nkrumah, Osagie, is, in my view, the high priest of it all. He sees it differently. Julius Nyerere, sees it differently. Magai of Sierra Leone, Tubman, Ahmed Ben Bella, and one can go on and on. They are saying there is something that unites us as Africans, and that thing is what must inform everything we do, leading to the very famous statement by the Osagie for himself, you are not an African because you are born in Africa, but you are an African because Africa is born in you. So that you can see the clarity and the purity of thought processes at that time. But the neo-colonial Europe is not resting. In former French colonies, what have they done? Félix Houphouët-Boigny is the deputy in the French parliament. Leopold Sédar Senghor is a deputy in the French parliament. And what they do, and excuse me, for the French, they also gave you a wife to ensure that you are under very close marking at all quarters. So you can see that your education beyond the Sorbonne, you are also educated at home. So, and all these things with the help of hindsight, they are very deliberate. They are very deliberate. And you can see that they are doing that because they want to ensure that even after you have left their country, they are still in control of their processes through you. In the United States of America, a debate now rages. The Taliaferro-Washington approach, where you conform without transforming, and the W.E.B. Du Bois approach, where you transform education. And remember, W.E.B. Du Bois is the person who then, I think he earned the first PhD, African-American, to earn a PhD at the University of Harvard. I think he's buried here in Ghana, W.E.B. Du Bois. And another man emerges from the United States, Carter G. Woodson, in 1933. He's involved in the education system, and he writes a book, The Miseducation of the Negro. He has now looked at the education system, and he's asking, what history are you teaching to young Africans? What geography are you teaching to young Africans? What chemistry are you teaching to young Africans? He's interrogating education at all levels because he knows that education is the key via which you can gain genuine transformation. Carter G. Woodson writes that book. But in 1933, outside of the United States of America, outside of the Caribbean, into the continent of Africa, we are already beginning to see agitation to regain independence, to become masters of our own affairs. It starts very early through various movements which are led by unschooled people, unschooled from the Western perspective. Agitation about land rights, because these are going to become important later, even at the university. The Mau Mau movement in Kenya, the Hehe Rebellion in Uganda in the 1990s, Omuka Makabarega of the Bunyoro Kitara Empire. Here in West Africa, we see the resistance in Benin, and we see the resistance among the Yoruba people, the Temne and the Mende in Sierra Leone. So there is activity across the continent culminating in the formation of political organization, paradoxically and ironically by the people who are trained in Europe and whom they thought would be their agents, giving meaning to what is written by Kenya's Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his book, The River Between, when he instructs his chief character, Waiyaki, go unto the white man and learn what he teaches you, but come back and do the right thing. You can see that the impact is also in the literature of it. So when you look at the books that are being written at that time in the 1950s, whether it is Chinua, who is writing, whether it's Sembene Otsman who is writing, whether it's Peter Abrahams who is writing, whether it's Alan Patton who is writing, you can see there is something about the writing at that time which is informing how you are going to organize yourselves. And when Nkrumah comes back to Ghana, invited by the UGCC, he finds a few conservatives, because there'll always be such, who think that the slave master's house is fine. Just make it a little better. And as one wise man said, one of the greatest danger, the most dangerous things is to have a happy slave. And as Malcolm X puts in his analogy of the house Negro and the field Negro, he says, the house Negro, when the master's house is burning, he says, our house is burning. But the field Negro says, let it burn down. So you can see, even within the educated class, the quality of education has affected people differently. And those of you who are Ghanaians now know when Kwame writes his book, Dark Days in Ghana, when he is exiled in Conakry, and he talks about why the CPP was, where he created his own political party, you can begin to see the urgency of the moment. And it's not only happening there, it is happening in different parts of the world. To me, in Africa, in the former French colonies, you can see the appetite now through the Pan-African spirit to do something to change. We fight and regain independence, and it's never lost on me that is those who are Western educated of whatever kind who are in the forefront of the struggle for independence. In South Africa, as I've already stated, it starts with Kaisa Kaseme, it starts with Lutuli. The other ones take it over, Nelson Mandela, and people like Mbeki a little later take it over. You go to SWAPO in Namibia, the ones who take it are Sam Nujoma, Andimba, Haman Toivo. You go to Mozambique, it is Mondlane and Samora. You go to Malawi, it is Kamuzu. You go to Zambia, it is Kaunda and Kapwepwe. You go to Angola, it is Neto, Savimbi, and Roberto. You come to Kenya, it is Jomo, Oginga, and Thomas Joseph Mboya, and Gikonya. Of independent African countries meet in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, from the 23rd to the 25th days of May. The agenda is loaded. Kwame is clear. But it must always be remembered that people meet in Addis Ababa when Africa is split into two ideologically on all things. The Monrovia group, led by William Tubman, including Felix Houphouët-Boigny, including Leopold Sédar Senghor, hold the view that we should slow things down. the Casablanca group, led by Kwame Nkrumah, Modibo Keita, Ahmed Ben Bella, Gamal Abdel Nasser, say we must change things now. So they meet in Addis Ababa as the Monrovia group and the Casablanca group. Ultimately, the OAU is a creation and a triumph for the Monrovia group. So Africa creates a weak organization. And I say this because ultimately when you look at the institutions that are then formed even on education, they begin to germinate from Addis Ababa. So we go back. And we start now to struggle for independence for the countries that have not regained independence. The Freedom Fighting Office is opened in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania to focus on apartheid, South Africa, and Ian Smith's Rhodesia and Southwest Africa and other countries that have not regained independence. But now, the new countries are faced with reality. You go to some of the countries, you only have one graduate or 10. And I want you to look at each one of those countries. Look at Rwanda, Urundi. There were no more than 10 graduates. Look at Kenya. There were no more than 500 graduates. And you can go on and on. You have a crisis of governance. In fact, the French countries are worse. Guinea-Conakry, I forgot to mention Ahmed Sékou Touré. When the French are leaving after the yes-no vote in 1958, they destroy everything in Algeria. They destroy everything in Guinea-Conakry. They destroy everything in Mali, then the Sudan. They destroy everything. Now, how do you govern? How do you have universities when there are no lecturers? How do you run your hospital facilities? How do you deal with agriculture? You've inherited institutions where there is not possibly a single African professor. How do you do this? The crisis of education now comes in, and you have to go into quick training. And that is where, and I'm jumping this, where the airlifts now come in. The airlifts are happening in different parts of the world. Ghana, you are now on a crash program, taking young people to the United States of America, taking people to the United Kingdom in Ruskin College, taking people later, of course, to the Patrice Emery Lumumba University in Moscow, because there is also a competition there. The Soviet Union, because it is now also a struggle for the neo-colonial project, is now alive. So in Kenya, they have what is fundamentally the Kennedy Airlift. The Kennedy Airlift in Kenya is initiated, actually, Kenyans don't actually accept, but this is the reality. The Kennedy Airlift is attributed to Thomas Joseph Mboya, but it was a Gikonyo Kiano, who, having earned his PhD in the United States, who came with the idea. And then they take 800 people to become the civil servants. On the other hand, the Soviet Union is also taking people to Hungary, East Germany, and the Soviet Union. There is a crash of people who then come back to become pioneer educationists. And you see it in Tanzania, you see it in different ways. And I say that we may understand the Pan-African component of education and the ever-present hand of the neo-colonizer in the entire arrangement. So those of you who went to the Soviet Union, you come in, once again, you always went there, and they came with Russian girls who are watching them very closely. And if you look very closely, out of 10, 7 were married to Russian girls or East German girls. Those who go to the United States, and for the ladies, of course, you are a little bit more discreet, so you never came with the men. But for the men, you find they come up either with the Caucasian or African Americans. But you can see the process of indoctrination is alive and well. So when they come back, they begin to populate our universities. And the universities are organized in a manner, as I said a little earlier, the East African University in Dar es Salaam, or rather in Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda, you now have specialty. It's called the University of East Africa. That is what we inherit. How do we deal with the University of East Africa? They were specialized. And I said a little earlier, some countries don't have a university at all. You are in Rhodesia, you are in Nyasaland, you are in Zambia. You begin to create universities. You create the University of Zambia. You are in Rwanda, Urundi. You create a university. You find yourself in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which immediately after 1961 there is a problem. How do you create a university? You are Dauda Kairaba Jawara in Gambia. You create a university. The only place you can go to is in Dakar, Senegal. You are in La Côte d'Ivoire. You are in all those countries. How do you create the university and who runs them? And many of you will remember that the first vice chancellors were foreigners for good reason. Some of you are here, you are there at that time, either as graduate assistants or tutorial fellows. Which books are you reading? Are they Pan-African books? Is Pan-Africanism still alive and well at that time? Because Pan-Africanism also demands, among other things, that the training is directed in a particular way. And you can see major activity. The Ghanaians will know when the Osagyefo comes, is in a hurry. Wibena. We never rather. Education is given its pride of place. When in 1969 is instituting the Kwame Nkrumah University Institute, which is now the Kwame Nkrumah University. And I want you to read his speech on that day about university education. He is telling Ghanaians, Ghana needs a new kind of man who thinks differently. And he is active across the continent of Africa. He says, we do a Kosombo Dam because we want engineers, we want electricity. He is telling Tubman in Liberia, don't sell your rubber. We tell Firestone, tires must be made here, therefore we need engineers. Train doctors here. That is the Osagyefo. Pan-Africanist to the hilt. Nyerere, being interviewed in 1967 about education, he says, the education system I've inherited here treats and creates an African man or woman whose greatest desire is to run away from his Africanness. We must change that. We must create an African who is educated and whose true north is the love for Africa. And you can see it in Senegal, much more sentimentally and romantically rather than practically. Leopold Sedar Senghor comes with the Negritude movement. And the Negritude movement has been criticized by some people. Like I know Wole Soyinka did not like it. But this is the genesis. Those of you who are students of history and philosophy will have heard of René Descartes, who says, dubito ego cogito, cogito ego sum. I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. And then Negritude says, I dance, therefore I am. And Wole said, this man is simply saying that our business as African is to dance. And you can remember the history of the Negritude movement and the Festival for Arts in 1966 in Dakar, Senegal, and the subsequent one in Surulere Stadium in 1977, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa Square, about Festac, celebrating art. Senghor responds by saying, I'm saying education must be complete. Maths, chemistry, biology, philosophy. But we must not forget the arts and the humanities. And is reinforced in this by Cheikh Anta Diop, for whom a university now exists in Senegal, and a philosophy of Diopism exists. You can now begin to see that there is this sometimes rising, sometimes ebbing away of the desire to create an education system that is going to address our needs. Africa is in a hurry. You made promises when you are struggling for independence that life will change. But where are the teachers to teach at your primary school? Where are the doctors to treat people? Where are the agriculture extension officers to make sure that agriculture works? Where are they? So what do? Many universities find themselves in crash programs. Education without philosophy. Education for acquisition of skills without more. And you can now begin to see all universities in Africa are essentially offering degrees that are not homegrown. Even our own high school examinations are not homegrown. It's Cambridge University, which is setting our education system for O-level and A-level. Our universities are linked. If it is the University of Ibadan, is offering the degrees of the University of London. Nairobi is offering the degrees of the University of London. The university in Angola is offering the degrees of Lisbon. There is an affiliation between the university in Abidjan and Sorbonne because you don't have the capacity. And I'm saying this, how does this affect the Pan-African project? Many of you will remember an experiment that was undertaken in biology by a Russian called Pavlov. You remember that? Conditional reflex. So the more you do it, the more it becomes natural to you. The more you got into these spaces, the more in your default moments you think in the manner in which you are conditioned. And I'm saying this, that our training then has a complete impact and indeed affects our worldview and our training. So that if I now begin to go into the last segment of my conversation, you are now talking about different things in different professions. Let's take the legal profession, for example. What is Pan-Africanist about the legal profession? There are three streams of legal profession that you see in Africa. There is the continental civil law system, which is unique to the French system, has elements of it in the former Portuguese colonies, the single former Spanish colony called Napoleon, derived from that tradition. That is the civil law system. And we say gleefully, we now are in our legal system independent, complete with how they dress, like Father Christmas. Then you have the common law system, which is derived from the law, the reception date, 12th of August, 1897, when we received the common law, and we are very happy about it. And even in Ghana, you can still see how your judges dress. Father Christmas and now Mother Christmas, complete with our speakers. Common law. Then when you go south, then other tradition is Dutch Roman. So what is Pan-African about all these? Nothing Pan-African about all these. And we say that African customary law is only applicable to the extent that it is not repugnant to justice and morality. Whose morality we do not say, but we know. So you can see how that kind of training does not allow you to have a Pan-Africanist view and a Pan-Africanist concept of justice. When we come to land tenure systems, here in Ghana, for example, you had land tenure systems in the different communities. You are now being told that we have imported a system of land tenure system from Torrens system in Australia to be applied here. You can now begin to see, and I say this because it is contemporary, even as I speak. I remember a case that was tried in Tanzania by a West African, I think he's Guyanese, Telford Georges. He was then the Chief Justice of Tanzania immediately after independence. And a Tanzanian man was charged with the offense of bigamy. And the offense, of course, when you are found guilty, you are then jailed, because the law said that marriage is the union of one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others. But then Telford Georges said, but in traditional African societies, marriage is the union of one man and all women. So he was saying that the mores of the society is different. So why do you criminalize? That was his argument. And you can see that these are extant issues about Pan-Africanism. How do you deal with people in that regard? And the most recent, those of you who come from Rwanda during the post-genocide, the Gacaca. The Gacaca jurisprudence is rich. How many people are rehabilitated through Gacaca? Hundreds of thousands. How many people has the Rwanda tribunal in Arusha tried? Not more than 10. And recently, Felicien Kabuga has no responsibility. Another one is arrested. How many years since the genocide? Can they go back into their societies? They cannot go back. Those who came to the Gacaca, are they back in communities? Yes. Pan-African. Is it homogeneous? No. It is unique. What is applicable amongst the Asante is not necessarily so amongst the Zulu. Unity in diversity. That is in the area of law. Medicine. Recently, what are we teaching in our medical schools? Is there something Pan-African about it? No. The greatest claim to fame of an African doctor is that I went to the London School of Tropical Medicine. And when they say it, they shake their head. Is there anything wrong with it? But I am urging you, if you ever want to get sick in Europe, don't have malaria, choose another disease. Because you then become a medical curiosity. They don't know how to deal with it. I'm sure some of you have found themselves in such a space. They don't. But are we undertaking research here? Right now in Africa, the greatest, the most famous research that is going on malaria vaccine is by the University of Oxford. They are funding it. It is we who should be funding that, because it is something that is common to us. Herbal medicine. Have we mainstreamed herbal medicine? No. Last year, a number of children died out of cough syrup in Gambia. Many of them out of some cough syrup medicine that was made in India, and the government of the Gambia has now hired an American law firm to represent them. I'm still talking about Pan-Africanism. So you can see, and recently during COVID, you could see when the Malagasy Institute of Applied Science came up with a medication, COVID organic. How many ordered it? Only 2 countries. 3, I think. John Joseph Magufuli in Tanzania, Equatorial Guinea, and I think Ghana doubled with it. But we have more faith in AstraZeneca, Moderna, Sputnik. And I asked at one time, does the Bureau of Standardization in any of our African countries have a standard for those vaccines? No. And why have you all been vaccinated? By faith. By faith. Because you don't know. So you can see that, but herbal medicine, and I'm saying this because this is Pan-Africanist. You go to India and look at Ayurveda, mainstreamed. They have mainstreamed their own medication. And people now go to health farms in India and Kerala. You go to China, they have mainstreamed their own medication. But you talk about African medicine, that was witch doctors. Our African doctors are witch doctors. Black magic. So I'm saying, why are we not teaching these? Go into engineering. Right now, in every African country, what you see are Chinese. We have been producing engineers in the thousands. But what do you see? Which begs the question, what are we teaching in our engineering schools? What about environment? Is there a Pan-Africanist element in that regard? Look at the plastic pollution. Look at our own contribution to the COP and climate change. The desertification arrest which we tried, and I think Senegal has done the best in terms of trying to arrest desertification. One can go on, but I want to conclude. What I'm saying, therefore, is we must decolonize our education system. And the decolonization of our education system means that we must revolutionize our curriculum. And when we look at our curriculum, we must ask ourselves what it is that we teach at our universities at all levels, whether it is in the sciences or in the humanities. It saddens me, and I know that knowledge has no geographical boundary. That I know. But I know that knowledge must also be localized in order to respond to the realities of a particular environment. If you go to the Scandinavians now, the Finnish model of education is praised. Who teaches in the kindergarten in Scandinavian countries? PhDs. Who teaches in our kindergartens? I'm not going to say who they are out of respect. But if the foundation is weak, then what are you doing? Some of our very best should teach at the foundational level. And I'm going to say that is how you begin to infuse this Pan-African concept in our entire discourse. You go to Scandinavia, see how they teach chemistry, the history of chemistry, the history of biology, the history of mathematics. So that when a child is saying, what is a zero? When did zero acquire value in the history of mathematics? They know. And all these can only be done by revamping our curriculum. And if that is done, it is you who are here, you men and women who are here, who are leading institutions that must begin to think about it and think about it very seriously. And I'm happy that Ashesi University is in that space and is therefore catalyzing the entire process of re-examining. Because Africa is now in a crisis, one may say, if you want to be negative about it, but I think it is on the cusp of something. We are at crossroads. It's a question of where we choose to go. Because crisis is the mother of invention and innovation throughout history. And if that be true, what is it that we can do in the context of Pan-Africanism? We are talking about Pan-Africanism, but Africa is now saying that there are things that we must do. We started saying this in 1908 with the Lagos Plan of Action and said Africa is going to trade to ensure that we increase trade up to 50%. We never did much with African continental free trade. We started saying that we must have African things. In the sector of aviation, in 1988, we came with the Yamoussoukro Declaration. In agriculture, we came up with the Malabo Declaration. We came up with the Declaration on Health in Abuja in 2001. On women, we came up with the Maputo Declaration. All these now must be taught at the universities. They are not being taught. Are we teaching Africa Agenda 2063 at any university on a serious note, or we just mention it fleetingly? Those of you who are in the departments of economics, are you teaching Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and are you looking at the tariff and non-tariff barriers here in ECOWAS? In SADC, are you looking at them? In East African Community, are we looking at them? In Central Africa, are we looking at them? In the Maghreb, are we looking at them? And I'm suggesting that it is only through a Pan-African approach In other words, telling us that there is something unique about the manner in which you do things. And there is something that is happening of a young man from the Gambia who got a scholarship to go to the United States, and he chose to go to the university in Rwanda, and I loved it. Because the Rwandese may be small, but there are certain things that they are getting right. Right now in Mauritius is a small country, but is becoming the focal point in terms of financials. Are we teaching that? Which books are we reading in our universities on economics? Are we reading Dambisa Moyo? Or we are reading Michael Todaro? In other words, we must begin to think differently. And I am saying that we must think like Kwame did and his stalwarts. That the time is now for us to realize that higher education is what is going to liberate Africa. And is only going to liberate Africa if we teach the right things. And is only going to liberate Africa if we implement the right things. And that is why I understand James Eman Kwejir Agri of Africa, who one day at a class, he came, and I paraphrase, and told his audience that one time a farmer, a naturalist, was walking in the forest, and he picked the young of an eagle and took it home. When he had taken it home, he kept it with his chicken and fed it on chicken feed for a long time. One day, somebody came, a naturalist came to the farmer and said, "Amongst your chicks, there is an eagle." And the farmer said, "I know. It's an eagle, but we have kept it here and fed it on chicken feed for a very long time. It is no longer an eagle. It is chicken." And the naturalist said, "No. Once you are an eagle, you are always an eagle. Let us try and see if it has some eaglehood remaining in it." And he put it on the palm of his hands and urged it to fly, and it refused to fly. And the farmer said, "I told you. It was once an eagle, but it's no longer an eagle. We have fed it on chicken feed for too long." The naturalist came again and said, "No, it is an eagle." So he put it on the palm of his hand, facing the sun, and it flew and flew, and he looked at the farmer and said, "No matter how long you feed an eagle on chicken feed, its eaglehood doesn't die. It may remember to come back to the chicken, but it is always an eagle." Africa is in that space. Let us be the eagle that James Eman Kwejir Agri talked about. Thank you.
Wow. Very thought-provoking historical articulation of the disjuncture between education and the ideals of Panafricanism. So I would permit 3 questions.